Welcome. So I just wanted to do a quick video to show how I've created a very simple bow and arrow. So here you can see a very rudimentary bow and a very rudimentary arrow. If I grab the arrow and I let go of it, nothing happens. If I grab the arrow and I grab the bow and I put them together and I let go, it flies off. Pretty simple, and then after a few seconds it will return here. There we go, returns to original position, and I can fire it up in the air like that, and you'll see it kind of has a slow arc. And the other thing you'll notice is if I grab it and I let go too far away, it's not going to do anything. It has to be within. You'll see the string. It's a really ugly string. I'm going to need to work on that. But as you can see, this works. And what I find most interesting about this is it's not relevant to the angle of the bow itself, but actually relevant to the angle of the arrow. So if I rotate this down and the arrow up, it still fires up. That might not be what you're going for, and we can talk about ways that you could fix that, but I think it is kind of a neat that it's following the arrow's path. So if you're, like this, but you rotate your arrow, upwards a little bit, it's gonna fire upwards rather than firing straight with your hand. So my hand is pointing straight with the bow, but if I wanted to fire upwards, that is how my controller's glitching out, my bad. Okay, but yeah, so you can see that works. We'll go ahead and let that go there. And let's take a look at how it's all coded together. So let's go ahead and first start by taking a look at the objects. As you can see, this is our arrow. This square here is an invisible square. You could also use a trigger icon, but I use this square because when you're creating, you can grab the square out, go into the properties, and make it grabbable, and then use grab anchor, and that tells you the direction. And so then you rotate it, not the grab anchor, but you rotate the square to match the direction, because this is forward facing. And so that's why it's launching straight, is because I've got an invisible square, and when you click that object first when you're grouping, it uses that to decide direction. So that's how that works. So we've done that. We've got an arrow here, and we'll go into the arrow. You can see the grab anchor is placed at the back end of the arrow. I use the snapping to make sure it's synced perfectly and straight. That makes it have the best look. And then we've got interactable with grabbable and physics. Gravity's on with metal. I felt like that was the most relevant for an arrow. The Z, this is the speed at which it's going. Firing from, so I have it currently set to fire from itself. It is possible to set it to fire from like the bow to, like I was saying, that was an option. I haven't tried it extensively, but it would be worth trying. The one issue that you usually have when you're firing from another object is that they collide a little bit. And so what you usually want to do is create a trigger or another invisible object that's non-collidable and make the object itself twice as big. That way, when it fires from, it's not firing from the center where the bow is, so it's like colliding with the wood, but instead it'll fire from out in front of it. Or you can make it slightly wider so it fires from, like, since this is a thin object, you could fire it from like to the right, just by making it slightly wider, because it uses the center point. So if I see these red dots, blue dots, so you find the center and that's where it's gonna fire from. So normally, if you can add an invisible object, you can move that red dot over, and that's what I usually do with like guns. So like this is my gun testing world actually, but anyway. So where is it firing from? And I've tagged it to itself, so it fires from itself. Original position is used in the code, and then the touching is a Boolean that we use to make sure that it's touching the object there. It's also worth noting that it has to be tagged arrow for the trigger to recognize that it's touching, so we tagged it as arrow. Okay, and we'll go take a look here at the bow. Now in the bow, you can see we've got our hand anchor there. Now this hand anchor didn't actually matter, so I just rotated it and have to put a square in there because I'm not firing from, but if you did want to fire from the bow object, you'd want to make sure you put it in one of those squares and select it first to make sure that direction is working. So here you can see it's visible, it's collidable, it's interactive, it has some physics. I set it to softwood because that seemed most relevant, and we don't have to tag it. And so then if we click this icon here, we can go inside of the object to edit inside. And now once we're inside, we can see here's our string object, which is honestly just a really skinny noodle. It doesn't look great, I will admit that. There's probably a better way to do it, but I didn't spend a ton of time making the bow, so I was just kind of coming up with something quick. Next up, we have triggering on objects tagged arrow. That's why it's triggering, because we created this trigger that surrounds the entire object. So if you really wanted it to be triggering only when it's right next to it, you could make this thinner, but I like having it a little bit wider. It removes the chance of the arrow having as many collisions. That was actually one other important thing I needed to say, is that this object here in the back is non-collidable. So if you go inside of the object after you've created it, you can adjust that one specific, it's like the tail feather, and I've made it so it's non-collidable, and that way when it's firing, it doesn't hit and like spin off, because originally it was firing straight, but then the tail feather would hit the bow and it would start spinning like this, and it was a mess, a real big mess. So just make that non-collidable, and that'll fix that. So here we can see the code is all running through the trigger. So all of the bow code runs through the trigger. So we've got it tagged on objects, and we've tagged the string. So basically just open up the string object and you can drag and connect that. The string scale is just used in the code. Scaling to is how big do you want it to be, so only 0.25. In this case, it doesn't need to be very big. And if we go in here, one of the tricks I've learned is if you click here, you can see it shows you what is the plus and the minus. So it says plus Y is that way, and you have, what is that, plus Z is this way. So when you come into this code here, the scaling to is based off of X, Y, and Z. So I knew I needed to increase my Y, so I just typed in plus 0.25. Okay, so that's how that works. Last but not least, let's actually take a look at the code. So the code's very simple. We're gonna go ahead and start with the bow trigger, and then we'll go into the arrow. Oh, I need to exit this object. Okay. Okay, in the bow code, very simple. When worlds is started, we're going to set the string scale. So remember, we have these variables here. So the string scale is a vector. So we're setting string scale to the scale of the string. And so that's the object tagged string. And then set scale to be the string scale plus scale to. So rather than having to type it in manually into the code, I'm just adding the two together. So that way it's amplifying it and not like making it too skinny somewhere or too wide somewhere. So it makes it look really clean, and we're just scaling it by 0.25. And if we wanted to, we could set it as a default to be 0.25 under scale 2, but I'm going to leave it as 0. When event trigger is entered with object, we're going to send event touch to that object. So this is the arrow. So when it triggers with the arrow, we're going to send the touch event to the arrow with a boolean of true. So that means that it is touching. And then we are going to send the scale to command to string over 1 second. And then when event trigger is exited, we're going to send the event touch with false to the arrow object. And we're also going to set the scale, the string scale back to original. So that's the original string scale that we set at the beginning of the world starting. And it's going to do it under 0.25 seconds, so it's really fast. Very simple code, very easy to do. So I don't really want to go too far into it. You have your trigger events here, and you can get all your math and stuff over here, plus, minus, equals, and whatnot. But if you have questions, you can ask. All right, next going into arrow. Under our arrow code is a little bit more complicated, but really not too much. Let's start at the bottom. So remember, we sent a touch event from the bow trigger, and that comes in with a boolean, which we've labeled as t. So when t is received, set touch to t. So we've created a boolean variable inside of here called touch, and it starts out as false, but when it is touching, it becomes true. And now, when the world is started, we're also going to set the original position to be the position of self. That's why it's always returning to its original position. Then we go to when event grab ends with players. So when you let go of the arrow, if touch is true, meaning we've received the touch event from the bow, then we're going to launch from self with a speed of z. So that's the speed we typed in before. So you can type that into the object and change it. Like you could have different speed arrows if you wanted. So you could create a bunch of different arrows and have different speeds on each of them. Then fire from. So it's going to launch from self, or excuse me, it's going to launch itself at a speed from whatever object you set, and we set it to be itself. Then we're going to rotate to 0, 0, 0 over 3 seconds on self. So this is when you fire it up, it's going to arc and become flat when it lands. Now this is mostly important for like, low arches. I'm not entirely convinced that firing straight up should be doing that. You could write some code to check, or you could make it do, rather than doing rotate to, you could be using the rotate by command. I did that initially, but I didn't want it to over arc. So like if you fired straight and then it's like arcing down, that's not exactly ideal. So I like the idea of it always going to 0, 0, 0, but that's personal preference. But if you really wanted to get into it, you could write some really ridiculous, like instead of sending this action, you could send an event to self called rotate to, and then under the rotate to event, you could check to see what the original rotation was, and based off of that, have it run different things. So like if you saw that the original rotation was straight up, then after so many seconds, it just like flips really quickly and comes straight down, right? So that would be one option. Or you could check and say, hey, if it was firing downward at a downward angle, then it's going to not rotate at all, it's just going to continue straight down. But if it's firing up at this angle, then it goes to 0, 0, but if it's firing up at this angle, maybe it goes downward a little bit. Anyway, you could get really, really complicated just running a bunch of different if statements for what the original firing angle was, but I didn't want to get into that because honestly, it's a little more than I am capable of doing at this point, and I think I'd do it wrong because it's a lot of math. Okay, going to the next. Then we're going to send event to my event to self after 6 seconds. Event to my event is running disabling self physics. Then it's moving to the original position and then re-enabling physics, so that way it's not in motion when it goes there. And that is it. Very, very simple. Very, very simple, and I hope that helps you out. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to answer them. But yeah, we're just basically running an arrow command, or arrow code, bow trigger, and it's very similar to like the gun, except for where I'm firing from the arrow itself, which is unique. I like it. Yeah. Thank you for watching. Bye.